Good evening. To start the night, why don't we greet our neighbors around with some kind of sign of peace, a wave. Oh, peace. So we gather tonight as Christians, as part of a community, and we're a group of people who believe in the resurrected Christ. We believe in the hope of the resurrection, that Christ broke through the death and the darkness and brought us life. And so we begin with a prayer in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. A reading from Isaiah. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings glad tidings, announcing peace, bearing good news, announcing salvation, and saying to Zion, your God is King. A poem attributed to Saint Teresa of Avila. Christ has no body but yours.
No hands, no feet on this earth but yours.
Yours are the eyes through which he looks with compassion on the world.
Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good.
Yours are the hands with which he blesses all the world.
Yours are the hands.
Yours are the feet.
Yours are the eyes.
You are his body.
Christ has no body but yours.
No hands, no feet on earth but yours.
Yours are the eyes through which he looks with compassion on the world.
Christ has no body now on earth but yours. Help us, God, to remember your love is greater than even death. Help us not only see and recognize the good in this world, but help us be your love and more good in the world. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Good evening and welcome. We are so very excited to have our speaker tonight. Her name is Mary Latham. She is the founder and vision person behind More Good. And the idea of More Good came out of words that Mary's mother shared with her. And Mary's mom said that while there will always be tragedies and horrible things that would inevitably happen in our lives, there would always be more good out there if we looked for it. So those words would eventually inspire Mary to take an amazing journey in search of that more good. And she's here from Orient, New York, to share herself and her journey with us. Mary Latham.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. So, I was just going to ask you guys a quick question out of a show of hands. Who's ever been in a hospital waiting room? So, the majority of us. Probably not like our first place we would want to go on a Friday night. Not the most fun we've ever had in our lives. I've been in a hospital waiting room for a lot of my life because my mom was diagnosed with cancer when I was in 7th grade. And I came up with this idea after spending so much time in hospital waiting rooms that I was going to create something for them because they felt pretty hopeless every time I was in there. And so I decided I was going to go out and collect some positive stories that I could put into a book to donate to waiting rooms. And I thought, well, I could just go out there and look for a few, or I could go to every single state and find a good story in every single state and then put all of the states into this book. I had no idea how I was going to do this, but I had a why. Next slide. This is one of the quotes that kind of led me through my trip. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. So I didn't know how I was going to do this, but I had a why. And the why was my mom. And my mom was probably the most optimistic, positive person I had ever met. even though she was going through a health issue and in the hospital all of the time, and not really dealt the best deck of cards in her life. She always had a smile on her face and was super, super positive. I actually have this one picture I'd like to share with you of her that I took. It was the last photo I took of her on the last Christmas that we had her. And she is opening a present that she bought herself with her own credit card and wrapped herself. And that's a genuine face right there. She was genuinely that happy and excited about it. And that was pretty much the best way I could think to describe her quickly to you guys. She was just extremely positive and happy and always had a smile on her face no matter what she was going through, and she was very, very kind. And in December of 2012, as some of you might remember, some of you guys are kind of young, so I don't know how old you would have been at this time, but there was a shooting at the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. And that day, as a lot of you probably already remember, was horrific, and there were a lot of children that were killed. And I was working at the time in New York City, and I was working at a law firm, and it was kind of just one of those jobs, like a 9-to-5, so I had health insurance and stability and could just scrape along to pay my rent for my shoebox apartment in New York City. And I was working that day, and I had just sat down to my desk, and I had opened my computer, and I was scrolling through all of the news about what was going on, and it was still happening. He was an active shooter, and I was kind of just staring at the screen in horror. And as I was doing that, one of the guys I worked with walked by my desk, and he said, "You should have come with me today to Starbucks." And he had no idea what was even happening at that moment, and I was staring at the news, and I kind of waved him away and said, I couldn't afford it today. And he stayed right there and said, no, it was free. And I kind of finally turned around and looked at him and said, what are you talking about? And he said, yeah, there was this guy, he was in there apparently buying gift cards because it was right before Christmas, and he was buying all these gift cards for employees, and then he randomly bought a $100 gift card and said, run it out on this line behind me. And so all of those people got a free coffee. And my friend who I worked with was a really positive guy and usually pretty optimistic, but he was not having a good year. His wife had left him, he had back surgery coming up, and he had just lost his mother 2 months prior to cancer. And so he was having a pretty rough time. But I distinctly remember that day as I sat at my desk looking at him, and he was glowing about this free $4, probably $10 now at Starbucks, coffee that he had gotten someone to buy for him. And he left my desk, and I kind of was just like, wow, that was a really beautiful thing. And my mom was going through her second round of cancer at the time, and so I would check in with her every morning. And so I gave her a call, and I told her the story really quick to cheer her up. She had no idea yet about the shooting, and I told her the quick coffee story, but then I started going on and on about the shooting, and how could this happen, and how is there so much bad out there, and the world is so scary. And she said, Mary, you gotta focus on that coffee story you just told me. There's always going to be tragedies and horrible things that will inevitably happen in our lives and in the world, but there'll always be more good out there if you look for it. And that sentence of more good was something I kind of sat with and focused on, and she was going through her treatments, things were not going well, and I went out with a friend a few nights later, and I was talking to my friend, and I told her about the conversation with my mom, and I told her the coffee story, and I said, it would be really cool if we could kind of focus on these stories a little bit more, and maybe we could try to dig some of them up and start some kind of little website, or back when Facebook was cool, start a Facebook page or do something like that. And she was like, yeah, I've always thought about that too. Maybe we could call it the Gratitude Project with 2 T's, like attitude. And we could just post these stories. So we decided we would do it. We posted on Facebook and asked people if anyone had a story of an act of human kindness that had happened in their lives, if they could email it to us. And so we launched it on Valentine's Day of 2013. And 11 days after the project launched, my mother ended up in the hospital for some surgery that was unsuccessful. And the doctor told us, a couple hours, couple days, and so my whole family kind of came together in that hospital waiting room. And she lived for 4 more days. And during those 4 days, I had to reach out to my job that I had at the law firm. I was also nannying for a few families because, again, New York City, very expensive. And so I reached out to all the different places I was working and let them know that I wouldn't be in for a few days. And while I was in my email checking and reaching out to them, I got an email from a girl who had a story. And I had set up an entire different email account for my project, but I wasn't thinking about it. I wasn't checking it. I didn't think there was any good out there. And when I got her story, I didn't realize it was a story. I just thought someone was emailing me something. And I read her story, and it was this really beautiful story. And the girl who sent it to me had already lost both of her parents. And I sat there thinking, she's gone through double what I'm about to go through. And here she is able to send me a story and focus on the good that someone did for her. And it was kind of just this little shred of hope during the worst time in my life. And so I read the story to my family, and I thought, you know, what am I doing here? I have this whole inbox. People are sending stories. The project had just begun. And so I opened the email, and I started sharing the stories with my family. And it was just kind of a little bit of help during that time. I distinctly remember there was a 30-year-old girl who was dying, and her parents were there. And they were fighting, they were divorced, and they were fighting about if she could see her ex-boyfriend or not. And there was a man sitting alone, and it just felt so depressing and so hopeless. And so that's kind of why I created this idea and thought, all right, I'm gonna take my mom's car. She had an old Subaru, and I was the youngest kid who was the only one that didn't have a car because I lived in New York City. So I got the car, and I decided I was gonna pack it up, and I was gonna go to every single state in America and try to find these stories. Because like any project that we begin, in the beginning it's like this great wave, and you have all these stories coming in, and people are excited for you, and then a few weeks pass, and it's harder, and you're not getting any emails. And so instead of getting discouraged and feeling like there was no good out there, I thought, well, I'm just gonna go out there and find my own stories and dig them up. So I did, and I left in October of 2016, and I went to every single state. It took me 3 years, 31 days, and 4 hours, but who's counting? And in order to do the project, I realized financially I was going to have to rely on some kindness. And so I made a little video explaining what I wanted to do and why I was doing it. And I posted it on Facebook, and I said, if anyone has an aunt in California or an old friend in Pennsylvania or a cousin in Texas that would let me crash on their couch or in their guest room as I make my way through their state, let me know. And so people started tagging people, and people reached out to me via email, and someone suggested, you know, well, you could reach out to people once you get to the states too, just figure out your first couple states. And so I started telling people in my community, because what I learned is if you really want to do something in your life and you have something you're very passionate about, tell a lot of people, because then you have to do it, and you're held accountable. And so I did that, and then they put it in my local newspaper, and I thought, uh-oh, I really do have to do this now, because all these people are going to be counting on me to return with some material. And so that was the first article that went out, and because of that article, my first state that I traveled to was Connecticut. And someone from Connecticut reached out that had a local newspaper there and said, we'd like to cover this if that will help you get some stories. And so that was kind of a huge part of my journey, is that local paper or radio stations would pick it up. I didn't necessarily want my face in there because I lived out of a car and didn't look that showered and wonderful all the time, but I wanted my project in there so people knew if I have a story, then you can reach out to me and I'll meet you at a coffee shop or at your home or wherever you are. So local papers and radio stations were a huge help. And what happened after the local papers would pick up my story is that people would reach out to me. So these were my first hosts, Lisa and John from Niantic, Connecticut, and they had seen the article, and they sent me a message and said, we'd love to host you. I didn't know them at all, no connections. And I thought, well, she looks nice. And so they hosted me the first night of my journey, and the first story that I collected during my trip was this really adorable little woman named Cordette. And when I met her to collect her story, she was with her husband, Frank, and he, you know, came over and he had his suspenders and a missing tooth, and he like took out an old crumpled $20 bill and he was like, here's for your first tank of gas. And Cordette showed up with 2 huge squash from her garden and said, oh, I brought these from my garden so that you could give them to your host. And it was just an amazing first experience, because to see the woman that was just gonna share a story with me also thinking about my host and something that she could provide for her. And the local coffee shop in that area was another person I had connected to at the time, and asked them, you know, is there any way, I sent them an email and said, is there any way that you could put something on your bulletin board maybe, because again, I had no idea how I was gonna find my stories at first. And I thought maybe they could put something on their bulletin board or on their Facebook page, and people would know that this girl's here and you can meet her at the coffee shop and share a story if you had one. And so they wrote back to me the next day when I was leaving, and they said, we're so sorry, but we just got your email, we were out of town, and we'd really still love to give you something at least for your trip. We would have loved to be able to help you more, but we know you're leaving today, but please stop by the shop. So I stopped by the shop, and they had 2 huge bags. One big tote bag full of water bottles and snacks and things for me for the road, and then another huge tote bag of 20 bags of coffee. And they said, well, we figured if you're staying with people, then at least you'll have something to offer them now. And again, it was another moment where it was like, these people are thinking of the other people that will be thinking of me, and it was just a really cool little circle. And they said, we have one other thing for you, but it's actually in the oven, and it's not ready yet. And I was like, oh, well, I really have to get back and go pack my bags and head out soon, but give them out to other people, that's fine. And so I went down the road 5 minutes, I went into the place I was staying, I was packing up, and when I got back to my car, there was a box of cookies. And so I have no idea how they found my car, because I was down the street, but obviously they must have known I was driving a blue Subaru. And so they left those cookies for me, and that was a really awesome little moment. And then I think it was maybe a week and a half after that, and I was staying with people, I was trying to find my stories, and a woman reached out to me on Facebook, and she said, I'd really love to be able to host you, and I'm in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, and whatever you need, I have a house here, and you're welcome to stay. And I saw your article in the Providence Journal, and I thought, okay, like she seems nice too, like let's look at her. And I clicked on her picture, and her Facebook picture was a picture of her riding a bicycle through a blueberry bog with a big sun hat and a little puppy in the front in the basket. And I thought, okay, this woman either writes children's books and is the nicest person in the world, or a serial killer. Either one, I'm not sure yet. So I figured, we'll see how she works out. And so I reached back out to her and I said, the only night I'd be able to come is on Thursday night if that works. And she said, okay, I'll be working that night, but I'll set up some dinner for you at least, and maybe it'll be nice for you to have a little downtime for yourself, which was nice, because when you are going into strangers' homes every single night for 3 years and 31 days and 4 hours, it is exhausting to be on all the time. And so I learned that pretty quick in the journey, and knowing that on my second week that I'd have this little spot and have like a little moment to relax. And so I said, you know what, that works out perfect. I'll get to visit with you, and then I'll get some work done. And so I arrived to her house around 4:30, and it was December in Maine, so it was cold, not as cold as you guys keep it around here, but it was very cold. And I remember I pulled up to her driveway, and it was a little sign. It said Turkey Hill Farm, and I started driving down the gravel driveway into the woods, losing service into a perfect horror movie. And I pull up into her driveway, and I go to the door, and it's this little white house with a blue door and a little tree swing, and there's a big garden in the back. And I walked into the door, because as I knocked, I heard her go, come in, come in. And I pushed it open, and there was a wood stove going, and so immediately you just get hit with all that warmth. And there's some muffins on the wood stove that she was making with the raspberries from her garden. And the whole house smells like lasagna, because she was cooking me dinner. And there was the record player in the corner, and the record player was playing Eva Cassidy. And I don't know if any of you guys know her, but she was a Canadian artist that was a really beautiful artist. And my mom would always play her when she would cook dinner. And it was playing, and not a lot of people know her. And so I walk into this house, and this is playing, and this woman comes out from the kitchen and just opens her arms, and she's like, you're here, welcome, and like just wraps me in this hug. This is before COVID. And I just thought, Mom, are you here? Like, what is going on? And so I'm not saying all the hosts were like that, but because of that experience, it made me realize that I could trust people, and that I would have to rely on the kindness of these total strangers that were welcoming me into their homes, and hope that if I was putting this good out there, that the good was going to come back. And so these were just a couple photos I took of my ridiculous little fairy tale stay with this woman. But that was in Cape Elizabeth, Maine. And so there were a couple different stories. In the beginning of the trip, I didn't really know what I'd be collecting. I thought maybe, someone bought someone a coffee, or these little types of stories. One of my absolute favorite stories in the beginning of the trip that someone told me was a really small story, but it stuck with me for the whole entire journey. And it was a woman who was a bank teller, and she was probably in her mid-20s, and she was working at a bank on Block Island one summer, and she was having a really bad day, and it was kind of visible on her face. And she was sitting at work, and another, stranger walked in to take some money out, and she looked at her and she said, are you doing okay? Like, is there anything I can do for you? And the woman, who was the bank teller, was really embarrassed and was like, oh, no, I'm fine. Nothing some M&Ms won't fix later when I get out of work. And they both laughed, and the woman left. And then 30 minutes later, that woman walked back in and slid a bag of M&Ms under the window to the lady and left, and she never saw her again, and she was convinced she was an angel. And I never asked the woman what was going on with her at the time. If, I just kind of assumed it was the beginning of my trip, and I just thought maybe, she stubbed her toe on the way to work, or her boyfriend broke up with her. But after I finished my journey, I thought, her uncle could have died in a car crash, or she could have been diagnosed with cancer that day. I mean, the amount of things that we're all going through, and all the people that are around us at all times are going through that we don't realize. I figured something pretty big must have been going on for her to remember such a tiny act of kindness, because she was telling me the story 30 years later. And she had never forgotten it, and she told her kids and her grandkids. And it was a really tiny story, but it was one of my favorite stories that I like to share, because there's a lot of different stories that I'm going to share with you in a moment. But this story was something that we can all do. I mean, maybe we can't do these huge, massive acts of kindness that we hear about or that make the news all the time, but buying a bag of M&Ms is something that we can probably all figure out how to do, and it's just these tiny little moments that could be affecting people years and years and years from now. But one of the other types of stories that I would collect was, I got to a community in Massachusetts, and they were all talking about a little boy named Ben. And I didn't know who Ben was, and they said, well, you have to meet him, you have to go meet him and his mother. And at 6 years old, Ben was diagnosed with cancer. And when he finally went into remission, his mother asked him, Ben, what do you want to do? We can go celebrate, we could go to Disney World, we could go to your favorite restaurant every Friday for this month. Like, how do you want to celebrate? And this little 7-year-old was like, I'd really like to just get hundreds of toys and bring them all to the kids that are still stuck in the hospital where I had to be. And so he went out and did a huge toy drive and dressed up like Captain America and delivered a bunch of toys to the Bay State Hospital in West Springfield, Massachusetts. And this is Ben. And that was the day I met him. And he even put on his uniform for me for his photo. And Ben's still doing well right now, and he is on his 5th toy drive. And so Ben was one type of story of just getting to a community and a lot of people talking about someone. It was never necessarily the people reached out to me and said, look how great I am, talk to me. It was always, I arrived somewhere and everyone talked about how wonderful this person was. So my next people are actually the reason I'm here tonight. I don't know how many of you guys know Peggy, who introduced me's children, who are the 3 children in that picture that aren't wearing the More Good shirt, and Bethany and Hannah both donated a kidney to a total stranger to honor their father, who passed away from kidney failure. So those are the big stories I was telling you guys about of the absolute angels that are walking amongst us. And I got to meet them, and it just so happened on the day of Bethany's surgery, after she's getting out of surgery, and her sister had been in the day before, and there I was, didn't know them at all, and just had a connection of a connection of a connection that told me about them, and I was just hanging out in their hospital room with their immediate family during that very intimate time to collect their story, which was really cool, because when I was in New York and people were just emailing me stories, it was beautiful and I could post their story, but now I was part of these stories and really getting to see all the behind the scenes. And then there were stories like Katie and Mike Emmons, who lost their son when he was 19. He was walking across the street and was hit by a car. And when his parents were both on their way to identify and bring their son home, the mother talked to her friend on the phone, and she said, they lived in a community in Sarasota, Florida, where the second anyone hears about something like this or some type of tragedy, the lawn is full of flowers and dishes of lasagna. And she really didn't want that. And she told her friend, please, tell people that we'd really like to set up a scholarship in honor of him instead. And this is like all in the first few hours of finding this information about her child. She was like, we'd rather just do something good instead of getting a bunch of flowers. And her friends set up a scholarship, and overnight they raised $185,000 and have now sent 12 kids to the school that he loved so much that would never be able to afford that tuition. And so there were types of stories like that. And then for my last type of story was Julie. And Julie was from Wichita, Kansas. And she happened to have been walking into a phone store at a time when it was getting robbed and was shot. And she was shot 3 times. And she was in the hospital for 145 days. She lost her arms from her elbows down and her legs from her knees down. And after she went through that, she decided that she would go and she would start helping other people. And it wasn't just that she went through that, but after 145 days in the hospital and coming home with no arms and no legs, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And it was a week after she had gotten out of the hospital. And I was sitting on her couch looking at her thinking, how does this woman do anything? And she said there was a point when she was laying on her couch and she thought, I could just pull this blanket over my head with my half a limb right now and give up, or I can buck up and make the best of this and try to help the next person. And so she goes into hospitals in the area and talks to people if they're children or adults that lose a limb randomly in an accident, and she'll talk to them and try to help them. Her story for me specifically was about a man who had heard her talk once and knew that she was struggling with getting the arms that she has, the mechanical arms and hands. Her insurance wasn't covering it, as if she hadn't been through enough. And so he was really trying hard. He worked for an insurance company. He was trying to figure out how he could help her, but he wasn't able to figure it out. But he and a friend had a lot of money, and he ended up buying the 2 arms for her that were over $200,000 each, and he delivered them to her on Christmas morning. And that was her story for me, and it was beautiful and it was amazing. But to me, she was the story, because people like her that I met on my trip were kind of my little more good heroes. Like, they kind of kept me going as I traveled along, because they were going. So I sure as heck could keep going. And they kind of got me to stay focused on my trip, because it was very challenging and difficult to keep going every single day. But when you think about people like that are able to get up and move and make a difference, then it inspires you to be able to also. One other little moment I quickly wanted to share with you was a moment when I was in Lake Tahoe, and my hosts, a lot of people would always say, well, what did you try the deep dish pizza in Chicago? Or, where was your favorite ice cream? Or what was the most beautiful state? And it was really hard to answer that question, because I didn't really get to experience all those things unless the people I stayed with brought me to see something beautiful or brought me to get ice cream. But a lot of the time I was just focused on the people of our country. And someone actually said it best when I was talking to them once. They were like, oh yeah, you were just meeting the people, so it's kind of like you were a tourist of humanity. It's like, that would be a good t-shirt. But I did really only get to talk to the people for the most part, except for in Lake Tahoe, where my host brought me there. And it was absolutely the most beautiful day in the entire world. And my host took a picture while I was just sitting there, probably meditating on how many more months am I going to be on the road, but looking at the beautiful view. And when I looked at the picture later on that night, I thought, man, every single day, which also helped my budget, I had a uniform. And it was this t-shirt, but in white. I just had a couple of them hanging in the back of my little closet in my car. And on the back of all my shirts is the map with my website. And so all of the photos that if I ever got anyone to take a picture, because you don't get a lot of pictures when you're by yourself on your trip, I always had this shirt, so it was a nice little memory. But in this one, I was like, I wish I had been wearing my shirt. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll go back tomorrow on my way to my next stop. It was about 45, 50 minutes out of the way, but for that view, I felt it was worth it. And so I left earlier in the morning that morning, and I'm starting to drive, and I'm making my way to Sacramento, and I start veering off to go back to Lake Tahoe. And as I'm, 30 minutes away, the skies go completely gray. And then I'm like another 5 minutes, and there's snow flurries, and I'm thinking, it was 65 yesterday, what's going on? And then the snow's really coming down, and by the time I get back to this exact spot, you can't see anything. Everything is gray, the fog is covering over the view, and it was just completely lost. So I just looked out and laughed and then left. And as I was driving down the road, there was a couple, and I was going, like, it was a little gravel road, and so I wasn't going very fast, and there was this kind of walkway into the woods, and it was all covered in snow, and it looked really beautiful, and there was a couple that was taking a selfie on it. Now, as a photographer, nothing hurts me more than seeing, nothing's wrong with a selfie, but when you're trying to take a selfie with a beautiful scene, you're not really getting the whole scene. So I pulled over and I was like, don't worry, I'm here, I'll take a picture quick for you. And so I jumped out of my car and I took a photo for them, and I was about to go back, and the guy said, well, don't you want one? And I thought, well, this place has no real significance to me, but I am wearing my shirt and I'll remember this funny memory. And so he starts getting down to take the picture, and he's like going like this, and I'm like, what is happening? And he's like, I'm sorry, there's just like this weird light coming at you, and the sun's over here, and I don't know what that is. And I kind of jokingly looked up and was like, yeah, it's probably my mom, because people would always say that to me, and I used to always get mad about it, but then I was like, I'll just accept it, maybe it's her. And so that was the picture. So I like to think it was her. Or it was a weird flare, who knows? But it's more comforting to think it was her with me. I also think, I hope she was with me, and I think she was with me, because if I stayed with 154 strangers around America and drove 43,000 miles, and I'm not even really that good of a driver, someone was watching out for me, I hope. I was in a bit of a protective bubble. But anyway, I just wanted to show you guys quickly before I let you have some questions. The next picture was kind of the inside of my car, where I had a bookcase. Didn't read any of those books, no time to read a book, but I thought it'd be comforting to feel like that was my little apartment. And then the next one was the last photo on the last day of my trip of all the stickers, every single, now to explain, I had gotten home, I had showered, and then someone from the newspaper came and took that photo of me, because usually I would not have this Beyonce hair and look kind of showered and nice, but that was a nice moment. It was my first night back in my own bed after the whole journey was done. And all the stickers were on the car, so that was really the last moment of the trip. And then the next slide is just a silly little. Oh no, that's actually the map. So that's my route that I did around the country, and it's not the best map because I made that myself in Photoshop, but that was the route that I took. I kind of went up through New England and then all the way down to Florida, across, and then up, and then through California, and then zigzagged the top of it. And then the next picture was a moment in South Dakota where I saw a camel, which was so random. And I just thought I'd share that with you guys. But I'd love to open it up if anyone has any questions, or you all officially think I'm crazy. But yeah, it was 3 years, and I stayed with 154 different strangers and collected a ton of stories. So hopefully that gives you guys a shred of hope too. Yeah. Oh wait, hold on, I think I'm supposed to give you the microphone. I think that's what professionals do. Oh. Did I ever just go to a town and, sorry. No, sometimes I would end up in a place where I might not have a connection yet, and I would always have a shelter. So the most important thing for me first was to find someone that would host me, which was the easiest part of the entire journey. People were always opening their doors to the point where I would have excess amount of people that had offered a home for me. Finding the stories was the hardest part, which I thought this was going to be the reverse. I thought I was going to have a hard time finding places to do laundry. Every home I walked into, the people were like, you got laundry here, a meal and everything. But people never felt their stories were big enough or important enough to share sometimes, so I really had to dig them out of them. But yeah, I definitely would arrive places. Sometimes people would invite their neighbors over, and I would just sit in the living room and talk to them and kind of explain my story, and then they would share things. And usually I would go to maybe a coffee shop, or just kind of walk around the community and try to reach out to different people and explain what I was doing, and then they'd say, oh yeah, well this person runs this type of organization, or this person has this nonprofit, and they can probably connect you to people. I do find that the biggest problem right now in our country is that we all kind of live in a bubble, and so it's not that nothing's wrong with that. We're working, we're going through our own struggles, but there were so many times when I would end up in a home and 2 houses down, there was this woman running this amazing organization and, taking older people that had no way of getting to the grocery store and stuff. They got a bus and they would and just on their own and fundraised, and they called it the Hope Bus, and they would drive these people to the grocery store so that these old people didn't have to walk 4 miles. And my host had no idea. They had no idea that it was going on. There was a bus in the driveway, 2 houses down, that says the Hope Bus. And then they would get involved a lot of the times too, or if they got inspired by the organization. But I think that our biggest issue is we don't know what's even going on in our own communities. And so that was kind of a cool thing for me to be able to go dig it up and bring it home and tell those people about them. Yeah? So I did not go right after my mom passed away. I wallowed and watched a lot of Netflix and felt bad for myself first, as one does sometimes. Everyone goes through grief differently, and then I realized this wouldn't make her happy. But I did need a minute to kind of figure myself out before I went out there and tried to put out a positive message when I was having a hard time believing it myself. But once I was ready, I was working in Manhattan, I had those jobs, and I had a friend that lived in St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and she was working on a charter boat there, and she reached out to me when I was on the bus back from Long Island to New York City to go back to work after my mom's funeral. And she said, "I've been thinking about you a lot, and I really think you should move here. I'm a wedding photographer, which is also why I was able to move around. It's a mobile job. And she said, you can do your wedding photography full time. You don't have to have all these other jobs to pay your rent. The rent's way cheaper here. You can live in the house I'm living in." And I kind of just laughed it off. Yeah, I'm gonna move to the Caribbean. My dad was falling apart. My parents had been married 40 years. I was the youngest of 4 kids. I wanted to be near my siblings. I had 2 roommates that were my best friends since preschool, living in Manhattan, all these jobs. And I got back to work the next day and kind of just robotically went through my work day, and then went to a happy hour with a friend that night. And my friend was talking all about how she had gone on a date, a Tinder date that she found, and he wasn't calling her back. And how unfair life was, and how does this always happen to me, and I can't believe this, and this boy's not calling me, and I thought we connected after one date for 2 hours. And I thought, cool. I just buried my mom, but your life is unfair. But I didn't, I just smiled and nodded. And then I went to work the next day and booked a one-way ticket to the Caribbean. And I gave my notice at work, and I figured out my stuff with my apartment, and I went home for the first holiday with my dad to get him through it, and I left the day after Christmas. And it was the scariest thing I've ever done in my life, and it was the first leap of faith. I was not sitting on a beach with a pina colada like I thought I would be. I was like living in a jungle in a frat house with crazy people, and everyone hitchhiked, and I was coming from Manhattan, and I thought, I'm not getting in a stranger's car, are you kidding me? And then I walked to town about 3 times in 95-degree heat, up and down hills in the Caribbean, and thought I'd rather get murdered, so I started hitchhiking, and it worked out, and everyone in the community was amazing, and it was kind of the first boost to be able to know, all right, you can trust people, and maybe this will work out. And so it was 2.5 years before I got in the car and got on the road. And a lot of people did say, was this a healing journey for you? It's not the first thing I think of when I describe my journey. It was the best thing I've ever done in my life. Living in the Caribbean, once I figured that out, was amazing. I think of all of the things I did in my life so far, doing the journey and helping people was the most important thing and the most impactful. But healing was a difficult word because all of my stories were shrouded in tragedy. And I sat for hours listening to these stories, and just from a glimpse of some of them, you can see it was more good at the end, but really it was a story of resilience of the people in our country that are still getting up every day and doing amazing things despite what they've been through. And so it was a lot to process, and it was emotional, and there were many days where I looked like a Sarah McLachlan commercial driving down the highway in my Subaru crying, thinking about my last story, probably looking crazy to anyone driving by me. But But in the end, yes, it was healing just to have all of that inspiration from all the people I met. Anybody else have a question for the crazy girl? Yeah. A QR code. No, it'll be a book. So my plan is kind of, I don't know how many of you know Tom's Shoes. So you buy a pair of shoes, it donates a pair. So, so I would like it to look like a coffee table book. And that way, because there's other hopeless, just depressing places besides hospital waiting rooms in the world right now, like our living rooms. And so if you wanted to buy one for your own coffee table, then you could, and then it would donate one. And you could pick what state and what hospital it went to. And if you have a personal connection, a family member, a friend that was in that hospital waiting room, maybe you write a little note about why you put this book in that room. So it'll be a physical book for people to read. Anybody else? It was really funny because I talked to a classroom when I was on my journey. It was third grade, I think it was second or third graders, and we were in their gymnasium, and it was in Rapid City, South Dakota, and it was on their, I think their Air Force base, and it was all these second and third graders in the classroom, and obviously I had to tone down my story a bit for some of the stories, but I did my best to kind of get through to them and explain what I had done. And at the end, when I said, does anyone have any questions, every single hand went up. There was like 80 kids, and everyone went up. Granted, the questions were, what's your favorite color, and did you drive to China? But they all had questions. And then I noticed as I talked to other classes, once we hit like 7th grade, I don't know, because some of you guys have to have questions for me. But yeah, I guess it's not cool to raise your hand anymore, so I don't know. But those 4th graders, they had a lot of questions. Yeah. Can you pull your mask down, because I'm hard of hearing, apparently.
Been going to the Caribbean, but have you ever thought of extending your journey to like different countries to look for stories? When I fell out of my car after 3 years, I didn't think about it right away about traveling to other countries. And then when the world shut down a month after I fell out of my car, I thought, that must be a sign that I'll sit down and write this book first. But it would be cool to continue, and there's definitely a lot of things. I think once you do this type of work and find so much purpose in it, it's very hard to go back to a cubicle in a law firm in New York City. But I think that I'm kind of figuring out my next steps of how to continue this type of work. And so that's been something I've been thinking about, but I haven't really gotten there yet just because of the state of the world. Oh, sorry. That is a great question that I don't have an answer. I collected a lot of stories, and I'm still kind of going through all of them right now. I'm going to have to condense it and only pick maybe 2 or 3 stories per state for the actual book, but I do plan to write my own book of the whole entire journey and all the people I stayed with after. So I'll have to get back to you on that. Yeah. Oh, no, I'm going to need the mic. Yeah, apparently I've lost my hearing. Was there a common place where like you found stories, or like a common theme or about any of the stories?
Was there
A common theme.
Here,
like
take it down. It's okay.
Did any of the stories have anything in common, like a common theme for most of them?
Well, I think, like I said earlier, the resilience was a common theme of just the type of people that they had a story of something really beautiful that had happened, but the reason that they acknowledged it so much or were able to see it so much is because they were going through something so dark. And so, it really meant a lot to them that someone had done some type of kindness. And it was just the concept of, here's a stranger and they're thinking of me. And I think that was the biggest lesson I really learned on the journey, was people really want to be listened to. And not a lot of people are listening right now. So when someone, like a stranger, does something kind for you, you're paying attention and appreciating it. Nobody?
Did you find, I expect that some people were less able to tell their stories to you than others. And I'm wondering if you had techniques that you use to draw people out to tell their stories.
Yeah, I feel like most of the time I would just kind of try to make it very casual and comfortable. I mean, when Peggy introduced me and said, I founded this, it sounds really fancy. It was just me. It was just a one-woman show. I fundraised, people donated to my gas tank, people hosted me and made me some dinner, and that was amazing. I was on a pretty strict budget. I wasn't sponsored, and so really it was just kind of me. And so I think when people realized that and saw that there was no video camera following me, this wasn't a show, it was just a person that genuinely cared about their story, and we just kind of started getting to know each other and have a conversation, and I smiled a lot, then they were comfortable and they would open up. And there was something comforting about the fact that I was transient and I was traveling through their town. I wasn't their neighbor, I wasn't their family member or their friend. I wasn't going to judge them. And they would really open up. And I obviously very much respected all of the people that I talked to, so I would never, put things that I know that they probably wouldn't want in the book, in the story, but I'd let them talk to me and tell me them anyway. Well, I will share one story since none of you guys have questions for me. One last quick story, but when I was about 2 months into my journey, I ended up in Washington, D.C., and I was really sick at the time, probably not actually physically sick, but just exhausted and run down so far from the journey. And I was having a really hard time collecting any stories. And again, like when I started the trip, I kind of thought, my inbox is going to be full. All these people are going to want to have stories, kind of like I thought everyone was going to have questions. And nothing was happening, and nothing was coming in. And I just felt pretty defeated. And I was staying with people in DC, and the woman had sent an email listserv out to her neighborhood of 120 people and said, this girl's here. If anyone has a story, someone bought you a coffee, anyone in the community, anything at all. Nothing. Crickets. No one responded. And I thought, all right, maybe we'll just call this journey kind of good and go back home and get into bed. But I was working still on my wedding photography. I'd finished an entire wedding season right before I got on the road, so I figured I'll just get some work done right now and go to my next place. Washington, D.C. is not even a state, so we don't even have to count it. And as I was kind of sitting there on my last day and preparing to leave in a few hours, I got an email from a girl named Karen, and she said, I'd really love to meet you and talk to you. And I couldn't really tell. Did she have a story? I didn't know if she just wanted to meet and ask some questions. And so I responded to her and I said, okay, when would you be able to meet? I'm actually leaving this evening by 6 o'clock. And she said, I'll be out of work at 4:30 and I work in McPherson Square, and so I could meet you there. And I said, okay. And it was, of course, all the way across town from where I was staying. It was pouring rain. It was January and cold, and I thought, all right, and traffic was starting, and I was like, I'm just gonna take an Uber. And so I called an Uber, and the Uber came, and I got in the car, and I was just kind of sitting there feeling really defeated. And the Uber driver kind of turned around, he said, oh, is that your home? And I said, no, I'm staying with someone. And he said, oh, you're not from here. And I was like, nope, no, I'm not from here. Not really answering the questions at all to try to derail the conversation, and thought I would just kind of sadly look out the window and be in my moment of sadness because I was feeling defeated. And he kept going, and he was like, well, where are you traveling from? And I was like, I'm coming from New York. And he was like, oh, well, did you fly here? And I said, nope, I drove. He said, oh, how long did it take you? I was like, my goodness, this guy is not going to stop. We weren't having that option yet to pick Quiet Ride, apparently. And so I said, it took me 2 months. And he said, 2 months? And I said, yeah, I've been stopping in every state along the way. I'm collecting stories of human kindness moments in people's lives when someone does something really nice for a stranger. And he said, I have a story for you. And I was kind of like, okay, like someone bought him ice cream once. Like I wasn't really thinking that much of his story, and was just like, oh, I'd love to hear it. And he said, yeah, so I came here from Sierra Leone about 20 years ago, and I came with a friend, and I had my place to stay with someone when I got here, but his place fell through, and he ended up in a shelter. And I had my job to work in this taxi business, and he was a doctor back in Sierra Leone, but he didn't have the right qualifications here, so he was actually working a newspaper route. And so every morning from 4 to 7 a.m., he was throwing the newspaper on the lawns of wealthy businessmen and women in Georgetown. And one morning, he was throwing the papers, and he threw the paper, and it hit the lamp outside of the door and broke it. And, it was 20 years ago. It was pitch black out. There was no security cameras. But he went, and he found a pen, and he found a paper, and he left a note and said, sorry, for breaking the lamp. I'll be back to pay. And so, sure enough, he shows back up at 9 a.m., and the guy who lived there was just getting home from a business trip. And so he had seen the note and sees the guy, and he invites him in for a cup of coffee. And they start talking, and he tells, the man's asking him about his life and just starting a conversation, and he tells him, and the man finds out he's traveling here, he can't be the doctor he wants to be, he's living in a shelter. And long story short, the businessman puts him up in a studio apartment and put him through med school, and he's a doctor in DC now. And I'm sitting in the back of this Uber going, what? Thought this was gonna be an ice cream story. And it was kind of one of those moments where it was the exact moment where I needed something like this, and I was just sitting there in shock that he had this beautiful story, and he's starting to pull up to the coffee shop where I was gonna meet this girl who didn't end up having a story, but if I didn't say yes to her, I would have never gotten in the Uber or gotten this one. And I'm sitting in the back, and he starts to pull up, and he says, it's because he left the note, and he did the right thing, and he left the note, and he did the right thing with his heart. And he pulls over, and he looks back at me, and he goes, it's just like what you're doing. The most important work you'll ever do is the work you do with your heart. And then he turned back around and said, oh, have a nice day. And I got out of the car crying and was like, what just happened? And that was kind of the phrase that sat with me for ever since that moment. And like I said, I lived in the Caribbean. Because of my wedding photography, been able to do a lot of amazing things. I went to Italy for a few months to work there and had all these amazing life experiences. But the most important work I ever did was this journey and getting these stories out and sharing all of these pieces of hope with people. And so I would say that was probably one of the biggest moments of my journey that I wanted to share with you guys. And Peggy is definitely a big part of why I'm here today and her amazing children. But another huge reason that I wanted to show you is a man named Casey. And that's him. His name is Casey Nichols. He's a journalism teacher in Rockland, California. And he was the journalism and also yearbook teacher. And he reached out to me during my journey, and he had seen the interview that I had done with MSNBC. I was about a year and a half into the trip. And he said, I'd really love if you could come into my classroom and talk to my kids. And I was like, go into a classroom and talk to teenagers? No, absolutely not. No way. And he, really convinced me though, and was like, I think your message is really important. I think they really need to hear it. And so I went to his school. I talked to his classes. I saw the way that his students respected him and listened to me and admired what he was doing and his way of teaching. And it was amazing to watch. And after I finished talking that day, one of his students came over to me and said, I don't know if you know this, but he wasn't even supposed to be in school today. He has a huge surgery tomorrow. And he has been fangirling about the fact that you were going to be able to come in finally. He didn't even think you'd respond to his email. Again, people thought I was important and had people helping me and working. No, it was just me. And so he didn't think you'd respond, and now you're here and you shared your message, and he was so excited about it. And he's really sick right now and going in for the surgery, but he came just for you. And so I ended up running out to my car before I left that day, and I got one of my more good shirts, because I would give these shirts to all the people that hosted me, so that when you open the book, the beginning of the 2 pages and the back pages will be thumbnail images of all the people across America that let me into their homes. And so I was always a little worried because, again, I was doing the shirts myself. I was trying to figure out my website myself, and so I was like, I don't know how many shirts I'm going to have. What if I give this to him, will the next person not get a shirt? And I just thought, it's just the right thing. I'm going to go give him the shirt. And I gave him the shirt, and he took that picture the next morning. He was walking into the OR, and he sent me that photo. And right after he got out of his surgery, he made time to email the entire journalism community around the country and tell them that I should come to their classroom and share my message with their students. And from that point on, I talked to high schools from California all the way back to New York. And it was a really amazing thing that he got me to do, even though I'm scared every time I have to talk to just teenagers. But I did it. It's like I'm back in high school every time I'm in a classroom or something. It never stops being scary presenting. But I did it thanks to him. And he actually passed away last week, the night before my birthday, and the night before I came here to share the message with people on Saturday morning and with you guys tonight. And I pretty much cried my entire flight here. And I've gotten to a better place now because I realized when I was on my way here from LaGuardia Airport, every single flight was canceled, or 2 of them were delayed, except for mine. And I was like, "Gah, he is really putting some work in right now to get me to go talk to students." So I hope one of you guys appreciates this message, because he really wanted me here to talk to you guys. But he was one of the best people that I know. He was helping me work on my book. He stayed in contact with me ever since my trip. He would send me messages randomly, out of the blue that was just, "I'm thinking of you, I'm rooting for you." But I wasn't the only one. He did it to all his students. His classroom was one where kids would just go and hang out and felt comfortable. And he always inspired his students to start the conversation and get their best stories. And that's the way you really do find your stories, by going home and asking your parents, like, what was high school like for you? Or what was your childhood like? And just kind of talking to your classmates, maybe talking to the people that are sitting by themselves and alone. I think everyone is going through some pretty dark times right now with mental health in schools, so I think that if you can be a little glimmer of light for them, and I can give you that kind of homework to take away so that you guys do something tomorrow in school where you give a little attention to someone that maybe looks like they need it in honor of Casey, that would be really special to me. That's all I got. I did make a little sign that I was really hoping that I could send to Casey's wife and his 13-year-old daughter, who are back in California right now missing their dad, that says "More good for Casey." And I was hoping maybe you guys would like to be in a picture with me and we could hold the sign up to send it to them. And if you would, please come to the stage. I also have bracelets and stickers for your water bottles if anyone's interested in any of them. Oh, thanks, girl. Hey. Look at you, you're the M.
Okay.
All right, you go over here. Second step. You're welcome.
I'll just stand behind you.
Here you go, you're an R.
Yay.
You're an E. You're a G. You're an O. You want one? All right, thanks, guys. Yeah, you got to be on the top. I don't know what this is. Yeah, I might have to move you. I might have to move you down a little bit. Oh yeah, that's some good stuff. Do you guys want to stand on the next step with them? Or we can sit on the floor, or I don't know, hang from the crux. I'm just kidding.
This is from my mom. She
Oh.
saw you last night.
Oh,
Yep.
thank you. I'm gonna scoot, oops, sorry. Get my bracelets. Sorry. Can you grab the bracelets and the stickers, actually? Thank you.
Let's go step.
Take this off. Here, let's move this table out of the way, because that's just blocking. probably good in case I want to hand these out as. Thank you.
So before everybody leaves, we have a couple more announcements. One is you can go to the More Good website if you would like to order a More Good t-shirt or sweatshirt. There's some really neat merchandise there. And then also,
Want a water bottle? Let me know. This is the
when we were planning this event with Mary, she happened to mention that it was her birthday weekend. And so we have a cupcake for her. And then there's also treats for everyone as you leave.